Welcome to another episode of the Apex Perspective podcast. Today I have with me Rahul Singh, who is currently the founder of Builder Magic. Now, Rahul is a multiple-time executive leading in engineering roles. He's also a multiple-time founder, but I'd like to hear more from Rahul himself. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background and how it led you to Builder Magic?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ariane. Very excited to be here, join you. Look, my background, I'm an engineer. I've always been an engineer. I graduated from Carnegie Mellon Robotics and Artificial Intelligence. And I was early engineer at AWS, one of the earliest engineers on the AWS team in 2004. I've been spending 9 years at Amazon. I was at the point in my life and career where I felt like really had to start a company. And that's when I started my first company, Distelli, which was a infrastructure software company which sold to enterprises, raised money from Andreessen Horowitz, and built a business selling to very, very large enterprises, Capital One, DocuSign, 2U, Walt Disney, and Oracle, amongst others. And that was a really, really great experience. I led that business for 5 years, grew that business as a sole single founder, had a great exit to Puppet. And since then, I've had executive roles at Puppet and Compass and most recently Twilio. I think the world has changed in the last sort of few years, and there was an inflection point sometime in 2025. And I think this was a good time for me to start my second venture, primarily because of the wide global adoption potential of artificial intelligence. See, I've always been in the field of AI, sort of classical AI for years, but now AI is going more mainstream and the number of applications for it are sort of unbound. And I think demand for inference and intelligence as a utility is going to be almost infinite. And so I think the market opportunity is very, very large. And that's what Builder Magic is focused on. It's a new company that is focused on helping other businesses, other companies, both build, operate agentic systems. Builder Magic is also building products that are designed for sort of self-service by small to medium-sized businesses and eventually enterprises. We're still early in the journey. And so I think, as we used to say in Amazon, this is still day one. Very exciting.
Very, very interesting. So when it comes to agentic AI specifically, are there particular workflows that you're focusing on as of right now?
Yeah, right now I think we're still a little bit early in enterprise adoption. I think a lot of the adoption is yet to come. Right now, my company is focused on the infrastructure space and sort of the early application level space. We're talking to a lot of customers. We've got a few clients right now that are starting to adopt a lot of the software and technology that we're building over here. And the key thing is you have to start from the bottom and grow from the top and grow to the top. You can't really build without having that core foundation. So there's, I think, important parts of the agentic stack that are still to be built. Things like agentic communication, real-time communication and chat for agents, routing infrastructure for intelligent agents, decision-making frameworks, feedback loops. Like one very interesting use case that we're talking to a lot of customers about is, think about most AI apps have a human component, the human-machine interface. And you'll notice that typically comes in the form of a thumbs up or a thumbs down button. Right? But when customer users press the thumbs down button on your AI native app, where does that signal go? And how do you feed that back to your agent to change behavior dynamically at runtime? Now, that's a very core problem that is sort of at the application level, but needs a lot of infrastructure behind it to really scale it up, right? I think that's one use case. And we're talking to customers across the board, and we're seeing a lot of such use cases. The key here is to really figure out the right steps to achieving those outcomes.
So the communication, the decision-making frameworks are all part of the infrastructure from what I'm hearing. What I'm also curious about is on the enterprise level, which will be a little bit later on. I actually spoke to the CTO of Aviatrix very recently, and one of the risks he talked about is deploying agentic AI at scale can open it up to a bit more cybersecurity risk. What are your perspectives on that? I believe it's due to sheer volume and the scale of it that causes the increase of risk. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand is that agentic deployments at small scale can be easily managed and governed, but that's not where we're going. The future holds, the future is going to be one where there's going to be hundreds, thousands of agents running within the enterprise, and those agents are going to spawn sub-agents and their own agents. And so it's at that scale where the problems are really magnified, just like any other problem. I think there's a whole swath of problems in agentic security, governance, compliance that are important to solve. And those as well need these sort of fundamental foundational pieces before you can get to the more complex cognitive workflows, right? How do you govern and constrain an agent's actions based on input and output? Well, you can't really build that layer till you have the sort of lower and middle layers of sort of basic communication, basic routing, basic persistence, storage for agentic AI figured out. And I think that infrastructure stack is super, super important. I know a lot of effort being put into the coding side, and I think that's a very, very important space. We are focused more on enterprise infrastructure, and obviously we're still early, but very exciting.
What changes with the infrastructure when you're doing it at scale, or when you're starting to go towards the enterprise level?
I think there's two dimensions to that. On the one hand, scale just has its sort of order of magnitude problem, right? Doing anything at small cardinality is fairly easy, and it doesn't really. It's when you start doing things at sort of enterprise scale with thousands or hundreds of thousands of units, whatever they may be, agents or requests per second, I think then the problems are really, really exacerbated. The other piece, obviously, is in enterprises is there's a lot of enterprise workflows, enterprise data that you have to control and govern access to. There's privacy implications, there's security implications, and even within an enterprise, there's things like need to know, data segregation. You really don't want to have all your agents or all your users, in fact, sort of have unfettered access to all of the data. You need things like audit logging, you need compliance checks, and you've got to be able to also have shutdown switches or kill switches where you can quickly shut down access to either a small segment of the system or what, and then at scale that can be non-trivial. I think we're very early in this ecosystem, and I think building these layers and these sort of infrastructure pieces as primitives is going to be critical.
Now, AI agentic infrastructure is very much applicable to multiple industries, but there's also nuances in different industries as well. One answer could be meaning different things in different industries. So how do you accommodate for that? And is there a particular industry where you have to be a bit more careful with deploying agentic AI?
I think that's a very astute observation. There's a few common things that apply to every industry, regardless of application. Things like communication, governance, storage, persistence, access control, like these fundamental pieces apply. But then as you get sort of more into specific workflows, you're right, there's some very important things. I think the two industries that I would apply a little bit extra thought, I think healthcare and finance.
Right.
I think both have very, very important sort of constraints that need extra thought. I'll give you an example. I think finance is a good one. We're working with a few customers where we're using agentic AI to do things like data extraction, auto categorization, to do analysis on financial data. Now, there's a privacy protection part of financial information. And that obviously is fairly standard to control for. The challenge in financial data management is that of accuracy and precision. Right? It is insufficient to simply have an LLM, say, scan a PDF and pull data out of it. OCR doesn't always work, and an LLM can potentially hallucinate. So how do you actually ensure that the data pulled out by an agent from a data store and the context thereof, or from a written document, how do you ensure that is both accurate and precise, that the agent hasn't either hallucinated or misread? And given that most of these are sort of systems that there's only a single signal, as in just that agent is pulling, there's nothing to compare it to. So then we get into these concepts of things like benchmarking, right? If you have one model produces a certain result from your financial data, how do you compare it to another model? How do you compare it to sort of human efforts? And I think this is especially important in financial data because things like social media or post a little bit of inaccuracy. There's some there's enough tolerance there. Once you get into financial data, it's very important that the data being managed by the agent is both accurate and precise.
Absolutely.
So I think
These are
healthcare and finance are the two ones.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking of healthcare first as well, but I think finance as well has those nuanced situations. Now I want to backtrack a little bit more to Distelli. I think that you led that company to a very successful run, and of course it was a 7-figure annual revenue. It was doing very, very well. We sold to over 70 clients, and the big company specifically. And I was really curious about how you validated the idea for that company. How did you validate the gap in the market in regard to that?
Yeah, I think there's two schools of thought, right? I think the one school of thought is it's very well sort of established in the entrepreneurship community, which is you go validate ideas with customers, or you learn about a space before you build anything, right? You go and you talk to customers, say, hey, tell me about your problem. Tell me about how you're solving this problem today. And then if you talk to enough people, you start to see that there's a common theme that everybody's having. And then you also validate whether they're willing to pay. And that's obviously one school of thought. That's called the discovery of problem. And then therefore you go build a prototype, and then you approach those and you've seeded your key marketplace. I think there's another school of thought, which is the knowing an industry well enough and just helping customers understand that this is a problem that they're going to have, right? Helping educate customers and bring to light that this is a problem that is at their doorstep, if not now, in the next few months. And so the problem that Distelli solved, we took the second approach, given my years of experience at AWS and having built cloud from the earliest days. I think in 2012, when I started that company, it was clear that a lot of workloads were actually running in private data centers and on-prem infrastructure, but cloud was starting to become fairly predominant. Those customers are migrating to AWS and other sort of cloud providers. And then when you start thinking about that, it becomes apparent with enough experience that soon you're going to have this problem where half your infrastructure is running in cloud and half of it running in on-prem. And it's going to look different, and you're going to manage it differently, and you're going to govern it differently. And that's a burden for enterprises. And so it became quickly apparent to me that that was a problem ripe to be solved at that time, because you wanted an infrastructure software layer that helped unify all your software in your enterprise with all the governance and controls, whether it ran on cloud or on-prem infrastructure. And that problem was, I took the second approach where I sort of went and talked to companies and said, this is a problem that I know is happening. I know that this is happening. And if you haven't encountered it yet, you're going to encounter it. And I think with that approach, you run the risk of you building something that nobody wants, but enough experience in the industry. And I think the thesis that I had turned out to be right. And we got a fair few customers that, well, initially they were like, well, we don't really see this problem because we're not migrating to the cloud. But soon as they started to migrate to cloud, we started to get calls saying like, hey, you're right. This is a problem we now we're facing. And the other piece is the urgency. As enterprises are moving to cloud, suddenly they realize that a lot of their cloud migrations, deployments, management, governance was missing in cloud that they had on-prem infrastructure. And that was starting to gate their velocity of development. And so I started getting a lot of calls. My team was getting a lot of calls on, hey, this is something that we actually need help with. And I think that thesis has proved out to be true.
And the principle you said about actually understanding an industry properly, it's one that applies to a lot of different entrepreneurs. I think if you live and breathe in industry for long enough, it's even these small circumstances you find gaps that maybe other people don't recognize. So I think that was a very good point you made. But what made you make the jump to become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I was at the point in my career at Amazon where I was very successful senior engineer, and but I do buy into what you'll hear Jeff Bezos talk about, the regret minimization framework. I've always been I like to build things. I like to take new ideas, bring them to life. And I think back in 2012, the point in my career where I was like, I must build a company. Otherwise, I just didn't want to be looking back 30 years from then and say, what if? So I felt it was the right time to take the leap. And I'm glad I did. It's been a rewarding journey. And it's been hugely impactful for.
And you've done very well. I'm curious, what do you think is the long-term vision for Builder Magic?
Yeah, I think with Builder Magic, look, like I said earlier, we're very, very early in AI, right? Things are moving very, very fast, but we're still very early. I think that's a huge opportunity to build core pieces of the agentic stack. There's a huge opportunity to help enterprises adopt core pieces of the agentic stack at the application or the infrastructure layer. And I think there's a huge market opportunity to sort of be part of an ecosystem that's going to grow sort of faster than anything else in the world. And so the big vision for Builder Magic is to not just build and operate infrastructure services and applications, but also to help enterprises adopt them, right? So this is a multi-pronged play and effort where Builder Magic will build software and services, but also works closely with customers on a day-to-day basis to help them adopt things. So this is both the services model and the software model all in one effort. The future of agentic AI, I think, is very much that of agents and businesses delivering outcomes to their customers rather than just pure software. And when you start talking about delivering outcomes for enterprises, you're more of a operator rather than just a software vendor. And I think that distinction is important. And my advice to all enterprises and leaders out there, and I've talked to many, many senior leaders at the CTO, CXO level, all of them are looking now at not just software vendors that provide software, but provide operating outcomes.
Yeah. So what I'll do now is go ahead and shift this conversation to a little bit more about you, Rahul. And I have a silly question for you first. I would say it's, or not super silly, but what made you want to stay in Seattle? Because I know you're now into entrepreneurship. Why did you choose to stay here? I know you were there since, I think maybe perhaps Amazon, but what compelled you to stay?
So yeah, I moved here in 2004 for Amazon. I was in Pittsburgh for 3.5 years at Carnegie Mellon at the Robotics Institute. I moved for Amazon, and I've stayed here ever since. A couple of reasons. My family's based here. My wife's family's based here, and this is a potentially a uncommon theme you'll hear. I actually like the weather in Seattle. I do prefer a little bit of the gray and the rainy, and I just love it's probably one of the most beautiful states. Washington State is beautiful. A lot of hiking, running, a lot of outdoors, and so yeah, I think we're going to be here for a long time.
What's something about you or your life that you wish more people knew about?
I tend to be a very private person, but in general, I think there's two sort of things that I think would serve anybody. One is I think focus is important for long-term success in business or in life, right? So I work really hard to make sure I'm focused on the things that I'm working on, and focus can work at a sort of micro scale, not just at a macro scale. We talk about focus at a macro scale, right? Make sure you're focused on this product and say no to all things, but also on a micro scale it matters, which is being present in a particular conversation or in a particular situation and sort of blocking everything out. So your mental energy can go towards that. And then when you context switch, you can sort of save to disk, as they say, and then switch to new context and be fully present in that. And I think that is that sort of level of focus, I think, is super, super important. It's still a lifelong journey for me. Still more work to be done there, but I think that is super critical personally for me to.
I was going to say, you can see the entire conversation. You've been very focused. I think that you can just see the way you're speaking about things. I think you can absolutely see how focused you are on this conversation. So I did want to point that out. Another question I have for you is, what do you think is the biggest difference between you in your 20s and you now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten more patience. I've learned that being patient is actually one of the most valuable traits anyone can have, especially at the senior executive level. Obviously, that is another lifelong journeys and learning. I don't think that that exercise in education will ever stop. I think that is one of the biggest things. I think the second piece is having a child, having a daughter has also changed how I view the world. I tend to think in much, much longer term horizons. I think about sort of the impact on what my daughter's going to see over the next 5, 10, 20 years, and the impact on my work over that long term, and sort of just how I think about things in general. So I think those are the two sort of big changes between sort of from 20 years ago and today.
Excellent. Now, what are the plans for you this year, whether that's professionally or personally?
Yeah, I think obviously growing the business, continuing to grow the business, continuing to talk to customers, continuing to sort of navigate and help understand and help others understand the current state of AI and where we're going. I think there's a small percent of the segment of the population and sort of the key centers in the industry where we're all working sort of almost at the bleeding edge, and sort of filtering that and understanding how that helps other sort of industries, other entrepreneurs, other businesses, other leaders is going to be key. So the goal for the rest of this year is to sort of aggressively grow the business, meet more sort of customers, understand their problems, and sort of help them solve their problems with sort of pragmatic outcomes.
Excellent. And where can people learn more about you and what you're doing?
Look, I'm a dad, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a builder, and I'm an engineer, and I'm an executive. It really depends on what part of the day you catch me on, what am I working on, and what am I focused on that. From a work perspective, I think building and selling, educating, helping others understand is super, super, super important. And then the other thing I would say is, I tend to approach most interactions from the point of view of like, what can I help this person with, as opposed to how can I extract value, right? Being able to take your first step and say, look, I'm here to help you, regardless of whether I get immediate value, I think is the right approach. I think that's that's the long-term thinking approach. The short-term approach is how can I extract immediate value out of every interaction. And I just don't think that short-term thinking approach works very well.
Agreed. And I think, is LinkedIn a good place to reach you?
Yeah, I'm active on LinkedIn. I tend not to be active on other sort of channels. I feel like I have a lot more to learn when it comes to things like Twitter X. I'm not so active there, but I probably should sort of try to engage more there. But yeah, LinkedIn is primarily where I'm focused right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me, Rahul. This was Aryan Mohindra and Rahul Singh.